The Oak Street route was the bane of my existence, a sprawling labyrinth of steep inclines and suburban pitfalls that seemed designed by a sadistic architect who hated humanity. My knees at 26 shouldn't have ached the way they did, but 3 years of hoisting 30-pound packages up flights of cracked concrete steps had taken their toll, leaving me with a perpetual stiffness that only a scalding shower could ease. I was a delivery driver for a major carrier, a blue-collared cog in the massive, relentless machine of modern convenience. My daily reality was a blur of scanning barcodes, dodging aggressive golden retrievers that thought my ankles were chew toys, and swearing at motion-activated sprinklers that always seemed to trigger exactly when I reached a front porch. The job was a sensory assault of exhaust fumes, stale coffee, and the constant ticking pressure of the handheld scanner. But then there was House 402. 402 was a modest mid-century modern home with cedar siding that had weathered into a beautiful silver-gray patina. It was framed by a meticulously kept garden of lavender, hostas, and ornamental grasses that swayed in the breeze like a welcoming committee. It sat at the crest of the steepest hill on the route, usually my final stop before the long downhill stretch back toward the depot. It should have been the house I hated most, the one that forced my van's engine to scream and protest, but instead it was the only one that made my heart do a nervous stuttering dance against my ribs. House 402 was where Bob lived. Bob was a recurring phenomenon in my life, a glitch in the otherwise monotonous matrix of my workday. I'd seen people in every state of disarray during my shifts, men in stained undershirts, women in silk robes clutching coffee like a weapon, and teenagers who looked like they hadn't seen natural sunlight in a calendar year. But Bob was different. Every time I rang his bell, the door would swing open to reveal a scene that felt like it belonged in a high-end cinematic romance. He would be there, standing in the doorway, usually damp from a recent shower. The scent of sandalwood and expensive soap would billow out like a localized weather system, and he would be wearing absolutely nothing but a thick white terry cloth towel knotted precariously at his hip. The first time it happened, I nearly dropped my scanner. He was a landscape of golden tan skin and lean, functional muscle. He wasn't the bulky gym bro type. He looked like he moved through the world with purpose, broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and the kind of collarbones you could imagine catching rainwater in. His hair was usually a dark, chaotic mess of wet curls, and his eyes always seemed to be searching for something just behind my shoulder. "Cutting it close today, Dylan," he'd say, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe. He always had a lopsided grin, a small knowing smirk that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing to my blood pressure and my ability to form coherent sentences. I'd clear my throat, my face burning a shade of red that probably matched my company vest with alarming accuracy. "Just need a signature, sir," I'd mutter, staring with agonizing intensity at the small LCD screen of my handheld device, as if it held the secrets to the universe. "Call me Bob. I've told you that 4 times now." I told myself it was just a joke, a bit of neighborhood weirdness to share with the guys at the depot over lukewarm beers, but as the weeks turned into months, the tension became a physical thing, a wire pulled tight between his porch and my van. I started noticing the small things that aren't on a delivery manifest. The way his eyes, a deep honey-flecked brown, would crinkle at the corners when he teased me. The way he never seemed to have a pen ready, which meant I had to hand him mine, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second in a way that felt like a low-voltage electric shock. One afternoon, when the heat was particularly brutal, he didn't just sign. He stood there, the towel looking like it was a single breath away from falling, and offered me a chilled bottle of water. "You look like you're melting, Dylan," he said softly. His thumb grazed the back of my hand as I took the bottle. The touch was intentional, a slow, lingering press that made the humid air feel even heavier. I didn't drink the water until I was 3 blocks away from his house, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. I found myself checking my hair in the rearview mirror 3 blocks from his house. I started timing my stops, realizing with a mixture of dread and exhilaration that he always seemed to just get out of the shower exactly when my tracking app notified me I was 2 stops away. It was a game we were playing, a silent, high-stakes dialogue conducted in damp towels and electronic signatures. Then came that Tuesday in November. The sky didn't just rain, it disintegrated. It was the kind of cold, driving deluge that turned the world into a gray smudge and soaked through waterproof gear in seconds. By the time I reached 402, I was a walking disaster. My uniform was a dark, heavy weight against my skin, my socks were sponges, and my boots made a pathetic squelching sound with every step. I was shielding a small square box under my jacket, something fragile judging by the glass stickers, and I was shivering so hard my teeth were literally clicking. The door opened before I could even reach for the bell. Bob was there, towel-clad as always, but the playful smirk was gone. His eyes widened as he took me in, soaked, shivering, and looking utterly defeated by the elements. "Dylan, you're freezing," he said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its teasing edge and replacing it with a raw, genuine concern that hit me harder than the cold. "I'm fine," I managed to stutter, holding out the damp scanner with a trembling hand. "Just sign here, please. I have 30 more stops." He didn't take the scanner. He didn't even look at the package. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my shoulder, his warmth radiating off him like a furnace in the frigid air. "Absolutely not," he said, firmly. His tone brooked no argument. "Get in here now." "I have a route." "The route can wait 10 minutes. You're blue in the face, Dylan. I've got a dryer, I've got coffee, and I'm pretty sure I have a spare sweatshirt that'll fit you. Get inside before you catch pneumonia and I lose my favorite delivery guy." I looked at the rain, which had turned into a literal wall of water, then back at him. My training manual had several chapters on maintaining professional boundaries, but my common sense was currently screaming for thermal regulation. I stepped over the threshold, and for the first time, the door to House 402 closed behind me, shutting out the storm. The interior of Bob's house was exactly how I had imagined it during long shifts. Warm, quiet, and smelling faintly of cinnamon, old books, and that signature sandalwood. He led me down a hallway lined with framed architectural sketches, precise, beautiful renderings of buildings that felt both modern and timeless. "Wait here," he commanded, gesturing toward a small bathroom. He disappeared for a moment and returned, mercifully, in a pair of gray sweatpants. However, he was still shirtless, his chest broad and bare, glistening slightly in the soft hallway light. He handed me a stock of fabric, a thick, oversized hoodie, and a pair of athletic shorts. "Dryer's right there. Toss your shirt and socks in. I'll go put the kettle on." Changing in his guest bathroom, I realized my hands were shaking, and it wasn't just the cold anymore. The hoodie smelled exactly like him, that clean, woody scent that had haunted my delivery route for months. It was soft and worn in, the kind of garment that felt like a hug. When I finally emerged, feeling human again, even if the shorts were 3 sizes too big and tied tight around my waist, I found him in the kitchen. He was leaning against the granite counter, 2 mugs of steam-curling coffee already waiting. He had finally pulled on a t-shirt, a simple black one that hugged his shoulders, but the image of him standing there shirtless just moments before was seared into my brain like a brand. "Better?" he asked, pushing a mug toward me. "Much," I said, wrapping my hands around the ceramic, letting the heat seep into my palms. "Thank you. Really, I didn't realize how much the cold had gotten to me." We didn't talk about deliveries. For the first time, the barrier of the scanner and the porch was gone. He told me he was a freelance architect, hence the sketches in the hall, and that he'd moved here from the city for the quiet, though he admitted the quiet was sometimes a bit much when you're living in a house built for more than one person. I told him about my half-finished degree in design, how I'd put it on hold when my mom got sick and the bills started piling up, and how the delivery job was supposed to be a temporary fix that had slowly become a permanent rut. He listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving. He wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. He was absorbing everything I said, his gaze fixed on mine with a gravity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "You know," I said, the caffeine finally giving me a boost of courage I wouldn't usually possess, "you could just wait 5 minutes to shower. You know exactly when I'm coming. My GPS location is public information." Bob leaned back, a slow, honest flush creeping up his neck. He didn't try to dodge the question or make a joke. "I know,
but I figured if I was in a towel, you'd have to look at me for at least 10 seconds longer than if I was in a t-shirt. I didn't know how else to make you stop running away, Dylan. You're always so focused on the next stop. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very thin, charged with a different kind of electricity than the storm outside. I looked down at my coffee, then back up at him, emboldened by his honesty. It worked, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I looked every single time. I even checked my hair in the mirror before pulling into your drive. He took a step toward me, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the heat of him again. The playful towel guy was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been waiting a lifetime for this specific Tuesday. He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw, his thumb smoothing over my bottom lip. Stay for dinner, Dylan. No towels, no scanners, just us. That rainy afternoon didn't just end with coffee. It ended with a quiet, lingering kiss by the front door, a promise of things to come that tasted like sandalwood and espresso. That Friday was our first real date. He showed up at my cramped apartment in a leather jacket and dark jeans, looking so handsome it made my chest ache. We went to a small, hole-in-the-wall Italian place where the tablecloths were checkered and the wine was served in thick tumblers. We talked until the staff started putting chairs on the tables around us, discussing everything from Bauhaus architecture to our shared hatred of cilantro. As we walked back to his car, he pulled me into the shadow of a brick building, his hand sliding up under my jacket to rest against my waist. The kiss was deep and hungry, a release of all the months of silent longing. The second date was a hike through the foothills. It was a crisp Saturday morning, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. As we climbed the steep trail, the sun began to bake the hillside. Halfway up the ridge, Bob stopped and pulled his shirt over his head, wiping sweat from his brow with the fabric. I stood there, ostensibly looking at the valley below, but my eyes were locked on the play of muscles in his back, the way the sun caught the golden tones of his skin and the fluid movement of his shoulders. He caught me staring and just smiled, reaching out to take my hand. "Come on," he said, pulling me toward the summit. "The view's better from the top, and I promise to keep the shirt off if it helps you keep up." At the peak, we sat on a flat rock, our shoulders touching. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "I've been on a lot of first dates, Dylan. None of them felt like this, like I was finally coming home." By the third date, we were back at House 402. The rain was falling again, a gentle rhythm against the cedar siding, but this time I wasn't in a uniform and I wasn't cold. We were on his sofa, a movie playing unnoticed in the background. The transition from talking to kissing felt like a slow, inevitable collision, a homecoming. When his hands found the hem of my shirt and mine found the warm, bare skin of his waist, it felt like the most natural geometry in the world. We moved to his bedroom, the space smelling of him, and the intimacy that followed was a revelation, a blend of fierce passion and a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. The intimacy wasn't just physical, though that was intoxicating. It was the way he'd tell me about his frustrations with a difficult client, or the way I'd confess my fear that my design skills had atrophied during my years on the road. It was Bob showing up at the delivery depot at 6 a.m. with a thermos of coffee and a breakfast burrito because he knew I had a double shift. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't looking, with a quiet, fierce kind of devotion that made me feel like the most important package he'd ever waited for.
Moving in together happened in stages, much like the construction of a building. First, it was a toothbrush and a phone charger, then a few boxes of my design books and my drafting kit. Finally, exactly a year after that rainy Tuesday, I handed in my notice at the delivery depot and moved my drafting table into the sun-drenched spare room of House 402. Our life became a series of shared, comfortable rhythms. I went back to school full-time, finally finishing my architecture degree with Bob as my unofficial tutor and constant cheerleader. Our mornings were a choreographed dance of coffee and shared space. I'd be hunched over a complex blueprint at the kitchen table, and Bob would come in, inevitably shirtless in the morning heat, to start the breakfast. He'd stand by the stove, the sunlight hitting his bare back, and I'd find myself sketching him in the margins of my structural plans. One Tuesday, the anniversary of our first real meeting, I was struggling.
A complex structural project for my final thesis was kicking my teeth in, and I was seconds away from tearing the vellum in half. I felt Bob's hands on my shoulders before I heard him. He was warm, his bare chest pressing against my back as he leaned down to look over my shoulder. "You're overthinking the load-bearing wall," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear, his hands rubbing the tension out of my neck. "Simplicity, Dylan. Look at the lines. Don't fight the gravity, work with it." I leaned back into him, closing my eyes and letting his strength support me. "I'm exhausted, Bob. I don't know if I'm cut out for this." He didn't offer platitudes. He just turned my chair around, pulled me to my feet, and held me. Standing there in the middle of our kitchen, with my head on his shoulder and my arms wrapped around his bare, solid waist, the stress of the project evaporated. This was the intimacy that people didn't tell you about. Not the grand gestures or the expensive gifts, but the quiet assurance that someone was there to catch the weight when it became too much to carry alone. He pulled back, cupping my face, and kissed me with a slow, deep intensity that said more than any "I believe in you" ever could. "I love you," I murmured into his skin, the scent of him grounding me. "I know," he said, his voice rumbly in his chest like distant thunder. "I've loved you since you were a grumpy delivery guy who wouldn't look me in the eye. I knew then that you had an eye for detail. You just needed a reason to stop and look." As the years passed, the towel guy legend became our favorite story to tell at dinner parties, usually as we served wine to friends on the cedar deck I'd helped him redesign. But behind the joke was a bedrock of mutual support. When I finally graduated and landed a job at a prestigious firm, Bob was the one who threw the party, inviting everyone from my old delivery depot just to see the look on their faces when they realized I'd married the guy from the hill. One winter, I got sick, a nasty flu that kept me bedridden for a week. Bob was tireless. He brought me soup, cooled my brow with damp cloths, and slept on the floor beside the bed because he didn't want to leave me but didn't want to wake me by moving. In those moments of feverish vulnerability, watching him move through the room, I realized that our love wasn't just a romance, it was a sanctuary. But we weren't married yet, not officially. 2 years after I'd moved in, I came home to find House 402 transformed. The walkway was lined with small, flickering lanterns, and the scent of lavender from the garden was overwhelming in the evening air. I used my key, but as I stepped inside, the house was silent and dim, lit only by candles. "Bob?" I called out, my heart starting that old, familiar stutter. I walked into the living room, and there he was. He was standing by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers reflecting off his skin, casting long, dramatic shadows. And, for old time's sake, he was wearing nothing but that same white terry cloth towel. "Dylan," he said, his voice thick with a nervous energy I'd rarely heard from him. "Is this a throwback?" I asked, smiling through the sudden, happy lump in my throat. He didn't laugh. He took a step toward me, the towel swaying slightly with his movement, his eyes locked on mine. "I spent months trying to get you to stay for 10 seconds. I used every trick in the book just to get you to see me as more than just a stop on your route. And these last few years have been the best of my life. But I'm tired of being just a stop, Dylan." He reached into the fold of the towel near his hip, where he had somehow managed to pin a small velvet box, and dropped to one knee. The towel brushed the floor as he looked up at me, his face full of a vulnerability that made him look younger, more raw. "I want to be the destination. I want to be the home you come back to every single night, not just because our names are on the deed, but because our lives are intertwined. Will you marry me?" I couldn't even get the word yes out. I just lunged at him, knocking us both onto the rug, laughing and crying simultaneously. The ring was simple, a band of brushed platinum, but as he slid it onto my finger, it felt like the final structural piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve since I first started driving that Oak Street route. Our wedding was held on a bright, breezy day in May in the garden of House 402. We'd thought about a big venue, something modern and glass-walled in the city, but in the end, we wanted to be where the first signature was signed. We wanted to be home. I didn't make him wear a towel down the aisle, though the temptation to suggest it was strong during the rehearsal. Instead, Bob stood at the front of the garden in a tailored navy suit that made him look like a movie star. The suit was perfect, but I knew what was underneath it. The strength, the warmth, and the man who had seen me when I was invisible to everyone else. When it was my turn to walk down the aisle, guided by the scent of the lavender we'd planted together, I saw him wipe a stray tear from his cheek and my own composure vanished. Our vows were unconventional, a reflection of our strange beginning. I promise to always sign for your packages, I said, making the guests chuckle and my old delivery buddies cheer. And I promise to always look at you for more than 10 seconds. I promise to be the one who brings the coffee when you're cold and the one who holds the blueprint when the lines get blurry. You were my favorite stop, Bob, and now you're my only one. Bob took my hands, his grip firm and warm, grounded. I promise to keep showering right before you come home, even if the app stops working, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I promise to be your advocate, your partner, and your biggest fan. I spent a long time waiting for you to walk through that door, Dylan. I'm never letting you go back out into the rain again. As we were declared husbands and the applause of our friends and family filled the air, I realized that the package I'd been delivering all those years ago wasn't just a box of books or a piece of hardware. It was an invitation to a life I hadn't known was possible. At the reception, held under a canopy of fairy lights in our own backyard, we danced until the stars were bright. During our first dance, the world seemed to shrink down until it was just the two of us, moving in a circle on the grass. I leaned my head against his shoulder, my hand resting on the back of his neck, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin even through the heavy fabric of his suit. "You look amazing in a suit," I whispered into his ear. He pulled back just enough to grin at me, the same lopsided, confident grin from House 402. "Yeah? You don't miss the towel? I could go put it on for the cake cutting." Maybe a little," I admitted, laughing. "But I think I like this version of us even better. It's more permanent." As the night wound down and the last of the guests departed, we found ourselves alone in our kitchen, the same place we'd had that first cup of coffee in the rain. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the lonely quiet Bob had described years ago. It was a full, satisfied silence. Bob shed his jacket and tie, tossing them onto a chair with a sigh of relief. He began unbuttoning his white shirt, and I watched him, the familiar geometry of his chest and shoulders coming into view. He pulled the shirt off and turned to me, his wedding band catching the light from the stove clock. "So, Mr. Architect, what's the plan for the rest of our lives? Any major renovations?" I smiled, resting my hands on his bare chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart under my palms, the heart of the man who had waited for me. "I think the foundation is pretty solid," I said. "I think we just keep building on what we have, one day at a time." The following morning, I woke up to the sun streaming through the window of our bedroom. Bob was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching me sleep. He was shirtless, the sheets pooled at his waist, and the look in his eyes was so full of love it felt like a physical weight. He leaned down, his lips meeting mine in a slow, sleepy kiss that tasted of mint and forever. "Morning, husband," he whispered. "Morning," I replied, pulling him closer. We weren't just a delivery driver and a customer anymore. We weren't just two people playing a game of cowls and signatures. We were a life, meticulously designed, built to last, and filled with the kind of love that doesn't need a tracking number. And as Bob leaned down to kiss me again, the scent of sandalwood still lingering in the air like a promise kept, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was home.